When people think of Catherine the Great, they imagine opulent palaces, political intrigue, and a woman who seized power through a coup. But Catherine didn't just rule Russia through force or charm. She ruled through money. She understood something most monarchs missed. Power without financial control is just theater. Catherine transformed Russia from a backward empire into a European powerhouse, not with armies alone, but with currency reform, trade expansion, and brutal economic pragmatism. And the methods she used, the manipulation, the debt, the wealth transfers, are the same ones governments deploy today. Let's set the stage. When Catherine took the throne in 1762, after overthrowing her incompetent husband Peter III, Russia was a mess. The treasury was nearly empty. The currency was debased and distrusted. Serfdom trapped millions in poverty while the nobility hoarded wealth. Trade with Europe was limited, and Russia's vast resources sat largely unexploited. Catherine inherited an empire, rich in land and people, but desperately poor in functioning economic infrastructure. Most rulers in her position would have raised taxes, squeezed the peasantry, and hoped for the best. Catherine did something different. She looked at money itself as the foundation of power. Control the currency, control trade, control debt, and you control the empire. Over her 34-year reign, she would use every financial tool available to centralize authority, enrich the state, and cement Russia's place among Europe's great powers. But like all economic transformations, hers came with a cost, and ordinary Russians paid for it. Catherine's first target was Russia's broken currency. When she took power, the ruble was a joke. Debased, inconsistent, and widely counterfeited. Merchants preferred foreign coins. Even the Russian government struggled to collect taxes in its own money. Catherine understood that a weak currency meant a weak state, so she stabilized it. She stopped the debasement that previous rulers had relied on, enforced strict standards for coin minting, and backed the ruble with Russia's massive reserves of silver and gold from Siberian mines. This wasn't charity, it was controlled. A stable currency meant Catherine could borrow money from European banks. It meant foreign merchants would trade with Russia. It meant the government could actually collect taxes that had real value. Within a decade, the ruble went from regional scrip to a currency accepted across Europe. And that credibility gave Catherine something previous Russian rulers never had: access to international credit markets. She could now finance wars, infrastructure, and expansion, not just with taxes, but with debt. And she used that leverage ruthlessly. But currency stability was just the foundation. Catherine's real genius was understanding trade as a weapon. Russia, under Catherine, became an export powerhouse. Grain, timber, flax, iron, furs. Europe needed these resources, and Catherine made sure Russia controlled the supply. She expanded ports on the Black Sea after wars with the Ottoman Empire, giving Russia direct access to Mediterranean trade routes. She negotiated trade agreements with Britain, France, and the German states that favored Russian exports. And here's where it gets interesting. Catherine didn't just sell resources, she manipulated the terms. During European grain shortages, she withheld exports to drive up prices, then flooded the market when competitors were weak. During wars, she sold timber and iron to both sides, profiting from conflict while keeping Russia officially neutral when convenient. Trade wasn't just about wealth, it was about leverage. European powers became economically dependent on Russia, which gave Catherine political power without firing a shot. She turned Russia's raw materials into geopolitical currency. Then there's the land grab. Catherine expanded Russia's territory by over 200,000 square miles during her reign. Crimea, parts of Poland, chunks of the Caucasus. But she didn't conquer these lands just for glory. She conquered them for resources. Crimea gave her control of Black Sea trade. Poland gave her grain-producing regions and access to European markets. The Caucasus gave her mineral wealth and control of trade routes to Persia. And once conquered, Catherine didn't just plant a flag. She restructured the economies of these territories to feed the Russian state. She redistributed land to loyal nobles, imposed Russian tax systems, and integrated local resources into the imperial supply chain. Conquest became economic annexation. The military did the fighting, but the treasury collected the winnings. This is the pattern empires always follow. War pays for itself when you steal the right assets. And Catherine was a master at identifying which territories were worth the cost of conquest. But Catherine also understood something darker. Debt is power, not just state debt, but private debt. She encouraged the Russian nobility to borrow heavily from state-backed banks that she controlled. These nobles used the money to build estates, buy serfs, and live lavishly. On the surface, it looked like prosperity. In reality, it was a trap. The more the nobles borrowed, the more dependent they became on Catherine's government. If they rebelled, she could call in their debts, seize their estates, and destroy them financially without ever raising an army. She applied the same logic internationally. Catherine loaned money to smaller European states and regional powers, Poland, Sweden, minor German principalities. When they couldn't repay, Catherine didn't forgive the debt. She used it as leverage for political concessions, trade agreements, or territorial claims. Debt became a weapon, and Catherine wielded it with precision. She understood what modern governments still know: the debtor is never free, and the creditor controls the game. Of course, all of this required money, more money than taxes alone could provide. So Catherine turned to a trick that governments have used for centuries. She printed it. Russia, under Catherine, issued paper currency, assignats, supposedly backed by the state's silver reserves. At first, it worked. Assignats circulated, trade expanded, and the economy seemed to boom. But Catherine printed more than the reserves could cover. She needed money for wars with the Ottomans, for infrastructure, for bribing the nobility, for maintaining her lavish court. The result was predictable: inflation. By the end of her reign, the assignat had lost much of its value. What could once buy a horse might now barely buy a saddle. Merchants demanded payment in silver or foreign currency. The peasantry, already crushed by serfdom, watched prices rise while their incomes stayed fixed. Catherine had financed her empire by quietly taxing everyone who held paper rubles. The wealth didn't disappear. It transferred from the bottom to the state and the elites who held real assets. It's the same trick Rome used with the denarius, the same trick Weimar used with the mark, and the same trick central banks use today with fiat currencies. And then there's serfdom. Catherine is often remembered as an enlightened ruler who corresponded with Voltaire and championed ideas of reason. But when it came to economics, she was anything but enlightened. Serfdom, the system that kept millions of Russians as virtual slaves, was the foundation of her economy. Serfs worked the land, produced the grain and resources that Catherine exported, and generated the wealth that funded her empire. And Catherine didn't just maintain serfdom, she expanded it. She granted vast estates and thousands of serfs to loyal nobles as rewards for service. By the end of her reign, serfdom had spread to regions where it had barely existed before. Catherine understood that cheap labor was the engine of her economic machine. Free the serfs, and the entire system collapses. So she kept them bound to the land, even as she talked about enlightenment and progress in her letters to Western philosophers. The hypocrisy was staggering, but the economic logic was clear. The empire's wealth was built on their backs, and Catherine was not about to give that up for ideals. So what's the lesson from Catherine the Great? That economic power is the foundation of political power. Catherine didn't just conquer territory or command armies. She controlled money, trade, debt, and labor. She stabilized the currency when it served her, then debased it through inflation when she needed funds. She turned trade into leverage, making Europe dependent on Russian resources. She used debt to control both her own nobility and foreign states, and she built her empire on the exploitation of millions who had no choice but to produce wealth they would never own. Catherine's methods aren't ancient history. They're the playbook. Modern governments still manipulate currency, control trade through tariffs and embargoes, use debt as a political weapon, and build economies on cheap labor, whether through minimum wage suppression or global supply chains. The scale has changed, the language has changed, but the game is exactly the same. Wealth flows to those who control the financial levers. Everyone else just works the machine. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Catherine succeeded because she understood what most people never learn. Money is not neutral. It's a tool of control. And those who master it don't just get rich, they rule empires. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gives you a new perspective, hit the like and subscribe button.